Chapter 11 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman, Wills, Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 11, A Deal in Jewellery. Inspector French's cheery self-confidence was never so strongly marked as when his mind was free from misgiving as to his course of action in the immediate future. When something was obviously waiting to be done, he invariably went straight in and did it, shrinking neither from difficulty nor unpleasantness, provided only he could carry through his task to a successful conclusion. It was only when he did not see his way clear that he became depressed, and then he grew surly as a bear with a sore head, and his subordinates kept at as great distance from him as their several activities would permit. On the morning following his conversation with the stout representative of the inquiry agency, he was in great form, signifying that not only were his plans for the day satisfactorily in being, but that no doubt of their super excellence clouded his mind. He had decided to call on the jewellers to whom Mrs. X had paid the checks, after which, if these visits indicated no fresh line of attack, he would prosecute inquiries at the White Star Company's office. By that time, a reply from Pittsburgh should have arrived. When he had made his usual report at the yard, he took out the checks and made a note of the places to be visited. The first two were in Piccadilly, and he began his quest by taking a bus thither. By 1 o'clock he had been round the whole 6, and as he sat lunching in a small French restaurant off Cranbourne Street, he thought over what he had learned. In each shop, after more or less delay, he had found the salesman who had served Mrs. X. All 6 men remembered her, and the proceedings with each seemed to have been the same. In each case, she had asked for a piece of jewellery for a dear friend who was going to be married, something plain but good. A diamond ring or a jewelled bangle, or some costly trifle which would please a young girl's fancy. In each shop, her purchases came to somewhere between £200 and £300, and in each case she had proffered a cheque. She had volunteered to wait while a messenger was sent to the bank, as she had admitted that she couldn't expect the shop people to take a cheque when they didn't know her. The salesmen had all protested that this was unnecessary, and had politely kept her talking while they took the precaution. Finally, a telephone from the bank having reassured them, they had handed her her purchase and bowed her out. None of them had either noticed or suspected anything unusual in the transactions, and all were satisfied everything about them was okay. French was considerably puzzled by the whole business, but under the stimulus of a cup of coffee, a possible theory flashed into his mind. Was it not probable that this purchase of costly but commonplace articles of jewellery at 6 different shops was simply a part of the plan to transform Mr. Duke's 16 stones into money? As he thought over it, French thought he could dimly grasp that plan as a whole. First, the minds of Mr. Williams and Mr. Hurst were prepared for what was coming by a previous visit. It was impossible that any suspicion could attach to that first visit, as when it was paid, the robbery had not taken place. And now French saw that, but for the accident of the clerk Archer visiting the office, these 2 gentlemen would not have known anything about the robbery when the second call was made, a distinctly clever achievement from the criminal's point of view. However, be that as it might, Mrs. X's bluff carried her through, and she exchanged the stones, or rather Mr. Duke's, for Mr. Williams' cheque. But she was evidently afraid to cash the whole of the cheque, and French saw her point, namely, that the opening of an account and lodging of £1,500 was an astute move, calculated to prevent the suspicion that might possibly caused by the cashing of £3,000 in small notes. But this safeguard left her with the necessity of devising a plan for cashing a deposit, and here in the purchase of the jewellery, French saw the plan. Would she not sell what she had just bought? If she could do so, there was the whole £3,000 changed into untraceable notes. Of course, there would be a loss at every step of the operation. There was first of all a loss in disposing of the jewels. Mr. Strong had valued them at £3,300, and she had received only £3,000 from Mr. Williams. She would lose even more heavily if she really had sold the jewellery she bought in Piccadilly and Regent Street, and she had lost a small deposit which she had left in a bank. But in spite of this, her scheme was well worthwhile. By it, she would obtain perhaps 70 or 80% of the value of the stones, whereas if she had dealt with one of the recognized fences, she would not have received more than from 15 to 20%. Moreover, her plan was safe. Up to the present, she had succeeded in concealing her identity, but application to a fence would have left her either in his power or blackmail, or in that of the intermediary she employed to reach him. No, the plan was clear enough and good enough too, and in spite of all French's optimism, there remained at the back of his mind the sinking fear that she might yet pull it off. But if this theory were true, it followed that if he could trace these sales, he would be furnished with another jumping-off place or places from which to resume his quest of the elusive Mrs. X. His next problem, therefore, became, had Mrs. X sold the trinkets, and if so, could he trace the sales? He went back to the 6 dwellers and obtained a detailed description of the articles bought. Then he returned to the yard, and with the help of a directory and his knowledge of the city, drew up a list of dealers who might be expected to handle such business. Half a dozen plainclothes men were then impressed into the service, with orders to call on these persons and find out if any of the articles in question had fallen into their hands. Inspector French had just completed these arrangements when a cable was handed to him. It was in reply to his of the previous night, and read, Mrs. Chauncey S. Root, Hotel Bellegarde, Meran, till end of month. Meran? That was in Switzerland, wasn't it? He sent up for an atlas and a continental Bradshaw and looked it up. Yes, it was in Switzerland. Moreover, it was close to where he had already been, past that lake with the marvelous colouring, the Lake of Thun, and so to Interlaken and the far-famed Bernese Oberland, places which he had long desired to visit. It was with more than a little eagerness that he once more ran over his reasons for wanting to see Mrs. Root, and then, satisfied, went to his chief's room. The great man listened and was convinced, and French, jubilant, went to prepare for his departure on the following evening. On his way to the yard next morning, he called at the White Star offices and got a copy of the Olympic's passenger list of the trip in question. The ship, they told him, was in Newark, but would be sailing in another 3 days. She would therefore be due in Southampton on the following Wednesday week. He learned also that specimens of the handwriting of each traveller were available. Forms were filled and declarations signed both in connection with the purchase of the ticket and with the passing of the luggage through the customs. If French was anxious to examine these, he could do so by applying to the Southampton office or to the customs authority in the same city. French decided that if his interview with Mrs. Root led to nothing, he would follow this advice, and he resolved that in this case he would go to Southampton when the Olympic was in, so as to interview the ship's staff as well. When he returned to the yard, he found that some information had already come in about the jewellery. One of his 6 plainclothes men had had a stroke of luck. At his very first call, Robson's of Oxford Street, he had found a ring which answered the description of one of the purchased articles, and which had been bought from a lady on the afternoon of the day after that on which Mrs. X had opened a bank account. He had taken the ring to Messrs. Lewis and Tottenham, who had made the sale in question, and they had identified it as that sold to Mrs. X and paid for by a Mrs. Root's cheque. Robson had paid £190 for it, while Messrs. Lewis and Tottenham had charged £225, so the lady had lost rather badly over the transaction. She had taken the money in notes of small value, the numbers of which had not been observed. The assistant at Robson's, who had served Mrs. X, could not recall her appearance. In fact, it was only when confronted with the records of the purchase that he remembered the matter at all. But he was satisfied the client was an American lady, and he thought she was neither very old nor very young, nor in any way remarkable looking. Inspector French was delighted with this news. It proved to him beyond possibility of doubt that his theory was correct. The purchase of these jewels was simply part of the plan to turn the stolen diamonds into money in a form which could not be traced. Further, it showed that he had been right in assuming the lady had not gone to France on the evening she drove to Victoria. On the following day she was still in London. But so far as he could see, the discovery brought him no nearer to finding the mysterious woman. The dealer's assistant could not describe her, nor had she left any traces which could be followed up. In fact, here was another promising clue which bade fair to vanish in smoke, and as he thought over the possibility, some measure of chagrin began to dull the keenness of his delight. During the forenoon, another of the plainclothes men struck oil, and by lunchtime a third transaction had come to light. Unfortunately, both of these cases was as unproductive as the original discovery. None of the shop people could remember who had sold the trinket. French went himself to each shop, but his most persistent efforts failed to extract any further information. That night he left from Murren. In due time he reached Bern, and changing trains, travelled down past Spies, under the great conical hill of Niesen, along the shores of the Lake of Thun, and into Interlaken. There he slept the night, and next morning took the narrow gauge line that led south into the heart of the giants of Bernese Oberland. He felt overpowered by the towering chain of mountains, the Matterhorn, the Eiger, the Monk, and Jungfrau, and as they wound their way up the narrow valley, he felt as if the overwhelming masses were closing down on him from either side. Reaching Lauterbrunnen, he went up by the funicular to the Murren Plateau, and continued his way by the electric tramway to the famous resort. There, as he walked to the Bellegarde, he gazed fascinated across the valley at the mighty buttresses of the Jungfrau, one summit of dazzling white succeeding another, up and up and up into the clear, thin blue of the sky. It took more to bring him to earth than a fellow traveller's gratified suggestion that at last they would be able to get a decent drink after all the travelling through the snow. He and his friend went to the bar of the Bellegarde and had two of scotch, and gradually the magic of the mountains faded, and the interview with Mrs. Root began to reassume its former importance. An examination of the register revealed the name Mrs. Chauncey S. Root, Pittsburgh, USA, same as at the Savoy, but here it was written in quite a different hand. The real Mrs. Root this time, French thought as he turned over from the office. He decided to wait until after lunch before tackling the lady, but he got the head waiter to point her out as she entered the restaurant. She undoubtedly answered the description given by the American detectives as well as by Mr. Williams, but on looking at her, he recognized more than ever the vague and unsatisfactory nature of that description. It was one that would apply to hundreds of women. In the lounge after lunch, he spoke to her. He apologized for intruding, explained who he was, and begged that she would give him an interview, and if possible, some information. "Why, certainly," she agreed. "We'll go right to my sitting room." And French told himself that from nowhere on earth, save the United States of America, could that voice have come. "You are Mrs. Chauncey S. Root," he began, when they were settled in the private room of the best suite the hotel contained. "I should be glad if, before we begin to talk, you would be good enough to let me see your passport. I shall explain why later." "I guess you'd better tell me first," she returned, leaning back in her armchair and lighting a cigarette. French smiled. "As you will, madam. The fact is that two ladies, each calling herself Mrs. Chauncey S. Root of Pittsburgh, USA, crossed by the Olympic to Southampton. I have been sent from Scotland Yard to find out which is the real one." The lady looked incredulous. "Say, now what started you on that yarn? I crossed by the Olympic, but there was no one else of that name aboard." Nevertheless, a Mrs. Chauncey S. Root, who had just crossed by the Olympic, turned up at the Savoy on the day the ship reached Liverpool, and put through a fraud on a man in London to the tune of £3,000. "I know, madam, it was not you, but I have to get some proof of it that will convince my superiors." With little ejaculations of interest and astonishment, the lady arose, and unlocking a dispatch case, took from it a book. "You can have that passport right now," she declared. "You have interested me quite a lot. Start writing and tell me the story." French examined the document, and as he did so, his last doubt vanished. The lady before him was Mrs. Root. Mrs. X remained Mrs. X. Asking her to keep the story to herself, he told her in considerable detail all that he knew of Mr. Williams' mysterious visitor, continuing, "Now, Mrs. Root, you will see where I want your help. Someone had impersonated you, someone who more than probably crossed with you from New York. I want you to think whom it might have been. Here's a copy of the passenger list. Please take your time and go over the people you met on the trip. Eliminate those you are sure of and put a mark opposite the others. You follow what I mean? I follow you all right. But it isn't as easy as you seem to think. I couldn't remember all the people I came across between New York and London. I suppose not. But after all, the thing isn't so big as that. Only a very few of the women would fill the bill. First, she must be roughly of your height and your figure, not very like, of course, but approximately. You need not mind her colouring, for she could make that up, except her eyes. Her eyes are a light golden brown. Can you remember anyone with eyes like that? The lady shook her head, and French went on. Then she must be a clever woman. Clever and courageous and determined, and something of an actress also. She must be all those things to have carried such a deal off successfully. French paused to allow his words to sink in, then continued once more. And she knows quite a lot about you. Not only has she observed your appearance, but she would obviously try to find out all she could about you, so that she might answer questions she might be asked. Do none of these points bring any to your mind? Please, Mrs. Root, try to help me. If you cannot give me some ideas, I may as well confess I don't know where to turn next. Well, I'll do what I can, but I don't see any light so far. She crossed the room and once more hunted through the dispatch case. Here are some pictures I took with my Kodak. Maybe they'll suggest someone. There were 24 or more photographs of groups of passengers taken on board the liner. Mrs. Root began with systematic precision to go through them. As she pointed to each individual, she repeated to the inspector what she knew about her. Mrs. Jeffs, guess she wouldn't do. Too fat. Miss, I just don't recall that young woman's name, but she's too tall anyway, half a head taller than me. Next is Heidi Squans, daughter of Old Man Squans of Consolidated Oil. I've known her since I've known anything. Then this one is, say now, who is this one? I've got it. Little girl called Dinsmore. Irish, I think. She's no good either. Eyes of the lightest blue I ever saw. Next is Mrs. Peirce. And so on for 25 minutes by the electric clock on the mantelpiece. French was highly delighted with the efficient way in which his hostess had tackled the job. But when all was said and done, the result was disappointingly small. 8 persons in the photographs had been marked as possibles, of whom Mrs. Root remembered the names of 5. Of these 5, one, a Mrs. Ward, whom Mrs. Root had met for the first time on board, seemed most likely for several reasons. She was about Mrs. Root's height, though stouter, had, Mrs. Root believed, light brown eyes, and had been friendly, and Mrs. Root now remembered just a trifle inquisitive, but she was ruled out by her nationality. That she was really English, as she claimed, Mrs. Root had no doubt whatever. French showed her the checks, but she could not recall ever having seen the handwriting in which they were filled out. But she did give him out one hint that he felt might prove valuable. She said that the stewardess who had looked after her cabin was a peculiarly intelligent and observant woman. Mrs. Root had been surprised on different occasions by the intimate knowledge of herself and her fellow travellers which this stewardess exhibited. She did not exactly accuse her of spying, but she thought she would be more likely to answer French's inquiries than anyone else he could find. She did not remember the woman's name, but she was rather striking looking, with dark eyes, a young face, and perfectly white hair, and he would have no difficulty in identifying her. Mrs. Root was extremely interested in the whole affair and begged the inspector to keep her posted as to developments. This he promised to do as he took his leave. He had now more reason than ever for visiting Southampton when the Olympic was next in, and he set out on the following morning on his return journey, reaching London on Tuesday afternoon. At the yard, he found that 3 more of the transactions of the mysterious lady had come to light, but unfortunately in each case without supplying any clue which might lead to her identification. These discoveries accounted for some £1,200 worth of the jewellery Mrs. X had bought, and for this she had received £1,090, making a loss on the transaction of only about 9%. He took an early opportunity of visiting Mr. Williams to ask him if he could identify his mysterious caller in Mrs. Root's group, but the moneylender was not illuminative. He did not reply for some time, turning the cards over as if uncertain, but finally He pointed to Mrs. Ward's figure. "That's like the lady," he said doubtfully, "but I confess I'm not sure of her. If it is she, it's an uncommon bad photograph." He continued staring at the picture. "You know," he went on slowly, "I have seen that woman before. That woman that you say is Mrs. Ward. I've certainly seen her somewhere. It's a curious thing, but I had the same impression when my visitor called here with the diamonds. I thought vaguely that I had seen her before, but I wasn't so sure as I'm about this Mrs. Ward. Somewhere, at some time, I've seen her. I wish to heaven I could remember where." "I wish to heaven you could," French agreed in somewhat aggrieved tones. "It would make things a lot easier for me. If I can't remember to help find my £3,000, it is not likely I shall be able to do it to ease your job," the other declared dryly. "I can't place her. I've thought and it's no good. Someone I've seen in a train or a restaurant, most likely. I don't think it's anyone I've ever met." French next called at the Piccadilly branch of the London and Counties Bank and saw Mr. Scarlett and the clerk Plenteous. Both these gentlemen hesitatingly selected Mrs. Ward's photograph as being like that of their mysterious client, though neither believed it was she. As in the case of Mr. Williams, the manager thought the lady's features were familiar, though he was sure he had never met her before. With this, French had to be content. He spent his afternoon in driving round the shops and agents with whom the elusive Mrs. X had dealt. Of the 11 assistants who had served her, 7 thought she was like Mrs. Ward, and 4 could not recall her appearance. All this testimony was very unsatisfactory to French, but he thought the balance of probability was in favor of Mrs. Ward being the woman he sought, and more hopeful than he had been for some time, he travelled down to Southampton on the Wednesday evening so as to be there for the arrival of the Olympic on the following day. The end of Chapter 11.